Alright guys, how's it going? We are going to be looking this week at 1980s TV history. This is going to be a lot of fun. I grew up in the 80s, and so a lot of these shows that we're talking about this week are shows that I grew up watching. Alright, so let's get started. MTV was launched in the United States in 1981 and had a profound impact on the music industry and popular culture further ahead, especially during its early run in the 1980s. I didn't really grow up watching MTV because my parents wouldn't let me. There were a lot of things on the network that weren't really kid appropriate. But it did make music videos a lot more mainstream, and a lot of bands became as famous for their music videos as they were for their music. Some of the most popular TV series which premiered during the 1980s or carried over from the 70s include, and this is going to be a long list, and as I read this list I'll pause and talk about some of these shows. Alf was one of them. Alf was a show I never really got into. Some of you guys may be more familiar with it than me. The main character, Alf, was supposed to be an alien. He was a puppet. Kind of a weird idea. The A-Team. The A-Team starred Mr. T. This was a show that I did watch some. This is probably what Mr. T is today most well known for. It's a pretty exciting show. The Love Boat. I never watched The Love Boat, but I remember seeing it advertised. The Incredible Hulk. Here's a picture of the Incredible Hulk. That's Lou Ferrigno, dressed in his Hulk costume. The Incredible Hulk starred Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby. Bill Bixby played David Banner, like in his normal self, and Lou Ferrigno played him when he morphed into the Hulk. This show started in the 70s and it carried over into the 1980s. It's a fun show. Lou Ferrigno's background was as a bodybuilder. For some of you that have taken my class before, you may remember I showed you guys a video of Lou Ferrigno a couple years ago, and we learned that he was actually very hard of hearing. He had a very significant hearing impairment, and that's one of the reasons why he got into bodybuilding, because bodybuilding was something that he could excel at, and his hearing deficit wasn't going to be a handicap for him as a bodybuilder. It didn't get in his way of working out and doing what he wanted to do as a bodybuilder. So it was a really cool video. It showed that this handicap of his didn't really slow him down. He was able to overcome it. Trapper John M.D., Different Strokes, Dynasty, Dallas, Knots Landing, One Day at a Time, Knight Rider. Knight Rider starred David Hasselhoff. Fun fact about Knight Rider, you know, the show is about this car that is able to communicate with David Hasselhoff's character. Some of you guys are probably familiar with Boy Meets World. Well, the actor who played Mr. Feeney on Boy Meets World was the same actor that did the voice of the car, Knight Rider. So that was kind of cool. Newhart was another show. This starred Bob Newhart. Bob Newhart had a show on the air in the 1970s. Starred Bob Newhart and Suzanne Plachette. This was his next show that came on the air. Pee-wee's Playhouse, Gimme a Break, Punky Brewster, Taxi. We talked about Taxi a good bit last time in the 1970s video. Happy Days. Happy Days had begun in the 70s. We talked about it last week as well. It had starred Tom Bosley, Ron Howard. Ron Howard had gotten his start as Opie on the Andy Griffith Show, and this was his next show. It also starred Henry Winkler as Arthur Fonzarelli, nicknamed the Fonz or Fonzie. The show, the original theme song was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets, and then later on in the show they had their own theme song. Alright, Saint Elsewhere, MacGyver, Magnum P.I., MASH, Barney Miller, WKRP in Cincinnati, Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy. Mork and Mindy actually featured Robin Williams. This was one of Robin Williams' earliest roles before he was really famous. Miami Vice, The Jeffersons, The Facts of Life, Hill Street Blues, um, The Cosby Show. The Cosby Show started in 1984 and it ran until 1992. This was kind of a groundbreaking show because it featured an African American cast being very successful and affluent, and it showed kind of a model of a family that could really succeed despite any kind of racial barriers. Let's see, what's next? Highway to Heaven was another show that came out in this decade. This starred Michael Landon. This was a show that he starred in after Little House on the Prairie ended. Murder, She Wrote. Murder, She Wrote ran from 1984 until 1996, ran for 12 years. Starred Angela Lansbury. In the show, she played Jessica Fletcher, a novelist who wrote murder mysteries. And each episode she would get kind of roped into helping with an actual murder mystery. It's kind of a fun show. Angela Lansbury is a good actress. 227, Matlock. Matlock starred Andy Griffith. And this show debuted in 1986 and it ran until 1996. The year that Matlock debuted was the year that the cast of the Andy Griffith Show came back for a television movie called Return to Mayberry. And Return to Mayberry was really well received. And initially there was hope that it might lead to other Mayberry-themed TV movies. But at that same time, Andy Griffith had just signed a contract to do Matlock, and he just didn't have time to do anything else. So because of Matlock, there were no other Andy Griffith Show movie reunions. In Matlock, Andy Griffith portrays a lawyer named Ben Matlock, who's a defense attorney, who each episode has to defend someone who's been falsely accused of a crime they didn't commit. The show also occasionally featured Don Knotts. Don Knotts was a relatively frequent guest star because Don Knotts and Andy Griffith were really good friends in real life. Star Trek: The Next Generation. This starred Patrick Stewart. Star Trek, the original series, hadn't been super popular during its initial run. It never made the top 25 in the Nielsen ratings. But after it ended, it became more and more popular, and there were some Star Trek movies that came out a few years after the show canceled. And by the 80s, there was a more definite fan base for Star Trek. And so Star Trek: The Next Generation ended up being a much bigger hit as far as ratings go than the original series had been. Night Court. Who's the Boss? Who's the Boss, I mentioned last week, starred Tony Danza as a former baseball player who is now working, doing housekeeping work to make a living for himself and his daughter. His daughter, Samantha, is portrayed by Alyssa Milano in the show. Charles in Charge, The Hogan Family, Perfect Strangers, Designing Women, Amen, Head of the Class, Murphy Brown, The Wonder Years. The Wonder Years starred Fred Savage, who, if you've ever seen The Princess Bride, the old comedy from 1987, Fred Savage was the boy who was sick, whose grandfather was reading him the story. Fred Savage is the brother of Ben Savage, who starred in Boy Meets World. And there was at least one episode, maybe two, where Fred Savage guest starred on Boy Meets World with his brother. The theme song to The Wonder Years was With a Little Help from My Friends, an old Beatles song. The theme song, though, was not the Beatles version. It was a cover version by Joe Cocker. All right, let's keep going. Empty Nest, Coach. Coach starred Craig T. Nelson. Craig T. Nelson, some of you may know this, some of you may not. Craig T. Nelson, the star of Coach, would later go on to be the voice of Mr. Incredible on the Pixar film The Incredibles. Coach also starred Jerry Van Dyke, the real-life brother of Dick Van Dyke. And it also starred Shelley Fabares, who had been an actress from the time she was very young. She had been one of the original stars of the Donna Reed show. Doogie Howser, MD. Quantum Leap. Saved by the Bell. Saved by the Bell is kind of a cool story. It originally started as a show called Good Morning, Miss Bliss. And the original star that was going to be kind of the center of the show was Haley Mills. She was going to play a school teacher, and the show was going to concern her and her relationship with her students. The show was set in Indiana. The original Good Morning Miss Bliss, they did, I think, 13 or 14 episodes. And in addition to Haley Mills, the show featured Dennis Haskins as Mr. Belding. It featured Mark Paul Gosselaar as Zach Morris. It featured Dustin Diamond as Screech. And it featured Lark Voorhees as Lisa. Well, when Good Morning Miss Bliss didn't take off and become successful, it was kind of rebooted about a year later as Saved by the Bell. But they kept the character of Mr. Belding, Screech, Zach, and Lisa, and then added some new characters. And they relocated to California. Instead of being in Indiana, they were now at Bayside High in California. But that's the origin of Saved by the Bell. If you go, what they did when the show, when Saved by the Bell went into rerun format in the mid '90s, they would often incorporate episodes from Good Morning Miss Bliss into the syndication, into the rerun format. And so that's how I saw some episodes of the original episodes with Haley Mills. Roseanne was another show that was on in this era. Welcome to Pooh Corner. Welcome to Pooh Corner ran from 1983 to 1986, and it was a show on the Disney Channel. It was actually the first show that the Disney Channel ever aired when the Disney Channel went on the air in 1983. It was not an animated television show. It was actors dressed up in costumes portraying the Pooh Bear characters. The voice of Winnie the Pooh on the show was actually Hal Smith. Hal Smith, you may remember, had been one of the cast members of the Andy Griffith Show. He played Otis Campbell. Hal Smith is a really talented voice actor too. He actually provided the voice of Owl on the original 1977 animated movie, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. He also had done the voice of Goliath, the dog, on Davy and Goliath, as well as most of the adult characters on Davy and Goliath. He did a good job as Winnie the Pooh. By the time this show came on the air, Sterling Holloway, the original voice of Winnie the Pooh, had retired. And Jim Cummings, who has done Winnie the Pooh more recently in cartoons and TV shows, hadn't begun to do the role of Winnie the Pooh yet, so Hal Smith did the role. Full House, another show from the 80s. It debuted in 1987. It ran into the mid-90s. The Golden Girls, Cheers, Growing Pains. We're going to talk more about Growing Pains next video because it ended in the 90s, so we'll cover it when we're discussing 90s television. Growing Pains was a really great show, though. It starred Alan Thicke. It starred Kirk Cameron. The last season or two also starred Leonardo DiCaprio. The theme song was sung by B.J. Thomas, who had been a big star dating back to the 60s. Got a very memorable theme song. All right, let's keep going. Benson, Soap, Family Ties. Family Ties, you may remember, starred Michael J. Fox in the role of Alex P. Keaton. When Michael J. Fox starred in Back to the Future, he was still involved in Family Ties, and he was doing both. So he was working incredibly long hours. He was working until the wee hours of the morning, doing his work on the movie. Then he was getting up, at dawn to do the work on the TV show. He kept a really crazy schedule there for a while. All right, let's keep going. Seinfeld. Seinfeld began in the 80s and it ended in the 90s. Hardcastle and McCormick. Let me show you the picture. This is a picture of the cast members of Hardcastle and McCormick. This is a show that unfortunately is not as well known today. It starred Daniel Hugh Kelly and Brian Keith. Brian Keith had been around for quite a while at this point. He was one of the stars of the original 1961 Parent Trap movie. In Hardcastle and McCormick, Brian Keith plays Milton C. Hardcastle, a retired judge. Daniel Hugh Kelly plays Mark McCormick, a former race car driver turned thief, who's been put in the custody of Hardcastle. And he drives a fancy red sports car called Coyote. And every episode, they have some kind of problem to solve, some bad guys to chase. It's got a really cool theme song. If you haven't ever heard the Hardcastle and McCormick theme song, you should look it up. The Simpsons. The Simpsons actually began in 1989, and it's actually still in the air. It's one of the longest running scripted TV shows in history. The World Wrestling Federation and the Dukes of Hazzard. I mentioned the Dukes of Hazzard last week when we were discussing the 70s. Alright, so that's just a rundown of some of the most popular shows from the 1980s. The 1980s was the decade of transformation in television. Cable television became more accessible and therefore more popular. Prior to the 1980s, most families in America had network television, ABC, NBC, CBS, maybe public television, and those were pretty much your only options. That changed in the 80s. By the middle of the decade, almost 70% of the American population had cable, and over 85% were paying for cable services such as HBO or Showtime. TV talk shows expanded in popularity. The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, remained popular into its third decade. And some of the most viewed newer shows were hosted by Geraldo Rivera, Arsenio Hall, and David Letterman. The 1980s was also prominent for spawning several popular children's cartoons. We're going to look at some of those now. One of the most popular was the Smurfs. The Smurfs was on the air from 1981 to 1989. Smurfs has one of the most memorable theme songs of any cartoon. La 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 la. The Transformers also was from this era. It came on the air from 1984 to 1987. Masters of the Universe was on the air from 1983 to 1984. G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, was on the air from 1985 to 1986. Inspector Gadget was on the air from 1983 to 1986. Here's a picture of Inspector Gadget. You may remember a couple weeks ago we were discussing the show Get Smart, starring Don Adams. The character of Inspector Gadget was sort of patterned after Maxwell Smart, the character on the show Get Smart. So Don Adams actually voiced Inspector Gadget. And this was a fun show. It was my brother's favorite cartoon when he was young. Muppet Babies was on the air from 1984 to 1991. Here's a picture that shows you some of the characters from Muppet Babies. This was a show that, again, was created by Jim Henson. This was geared more specifically to children. The Muppet Show, which we talked about last week, was really geared more towards adults. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, when it was on the air from 1987 to 1996. Here's a picture of the original Ninja Turtles. The Ninja Turtles were created in 1984, and they debuted as a cartoon 3 years later. They remained popular up till current times. There have been several different manifestations of the Turtles in movies and TV shows ever since then, but the original show began in 1987. DuckTales was on the air from 1987 to 1990. Here's an image of DuckTales. The voice of Scrooge McDuck on DuckTales was provided by Alan Young. We talked about him a couple weeks ago. Alan Young played Wilbur Post on Mr. Ed. He actually was originally from Scotland, and so he could do a Scottish accent very easily. He was a really talented voice actor. He actually only recently died, about 3 or 4 years ago. He died, I think, at age 96 or 97, but he provided the voice of Scrooge McDuck for a long time. Garfield and Friends was on the air from 1988 to 1994. Here's a picture of Garfield and Friends. This was a great show. It's one of my favorite shows from this era. Lorenzo Music did a great job as the voice of Garfield. Really captured the spirit of the character that Jim Davis had created. Heathcliff ran from 1984 to 1988. Fun fact about Heathcliff, the voice of Heathcliff was provided by Mel Blanc, who had been this legendary voice actor who did all the Looney Tunes voices. Heathcliff was the last new original character that Mel Blanc ever provided a voice for. Then last on the list is Beetlejuice, which ran from 1989 to 1991. Here's a picture of Beetlejuice. This was based on the movie that had come out in 1988, directed by Tim Burton, starring Michael Keaton. And then the final one to look at is Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, which debuted in 1989. Here's a picture of Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. So there were a lot of great shows for kids back in the 1980s. We're going to do now a quiz, looking at some of these shows. These are all true-false questions, except for one multiple-choice question at the end. All right, true or false? Alan Young provided the voice of Scrooge McDuck on DuckTales. Alan Young provided the voice of Scrooge McDuck on DuckTales. That is true. If you've ever seen the old cartoon Mickey's Christmas Carol, which was based on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you may remember that Alan Young also provided the voice of Ebenezer Scrooge on that cartoon as well. Number 2, true or false? Lorenzo Music provided the voice of Garfield in Garfield and Friends. Lorenzo Music provided the voice of Garfield in Garfield and Friends. That is true. Lorenzo Music passed away a few years ago. A few years ago, they did a live-action Garfield movie where all the characters were actors, but Garfield was computer animated. In that movie, Bill Murray actually provided the voice of Garfield. He did a pretty good job of kind of capturing Lorenzo Music's personality. The Garfield show, which was a more recent cartoon version of Garfield, in that show, the actor who provided the voice of Garfield was the same actor that had provided the voice of Fred on the original Scooby-Doo. So there have been several different actors over the years that have done the role, but Lorenzo Music was the first. All right, number 3, true or false? Beetlejuice, the animated series, was based on the 1988 Tim Burton film. Beetlejuice, the animated series, was based on the 1988 Tim Burton film. That is true. The film came out in '88, and the cartoon began the following year in 1989. The movie's actually kind of creepy. The TV show is a cartoon aimed at kids, so it's not as creepy. But I don't recommend the movie for young kids. It's creepy. Number 4, true or false? Don Adams is the voice of the villainous Dr. Claw in Inspector Gadget. Don Adams is the voice of the villainous Dr. Claw in Inspector Gadget. That's false. Don Adams is one of the cast members, but he provided the voice of Inspector Gadget, not the villain, Dr. Claw. So number 4 is false. Number 5, Splinter is the name of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles' mortal enemy. Splinter is the name of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles' mortal enemy. We didn't really discuss this earlier, but this just is to test how much you know about the Turtles. That's false. Splinter is the name of their teacher, their sensei, and Shredder is the name of their mortal enemy, who's always trying to defeat them. Splinter's a good guy, Shredder's a bad guy. Number 6, true or false? Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers debuted in the fall of 1989. Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers debuted in the fall of 1989. That is true. It debuted the fall that I started first grade. So I remember finishing school and looking forward to catching Chip and Dale on TV. Number 7, Mississippi native Jim Henson created the characters for Fraggle Rock, plus this 1980s cartoon. A, Heathcliff, B, Muppet Babies, or C, Smurfs. Let me read that again. Mississippi native Jim Henson created the characters for Fraggle Rock, plus this 1980s cartoon. A, Heathcliff, B, Muppet Babies, C, Smurfs. And the answer is B, Muppet Babies. We didn't talk about Fraggle Rock, but it was another show that Jim Henson had created. Jim Henson was a super creative guy. All right, so that's a look at 1980s television. Next time we get together, we're going to look at 1990s television, which is fun. There's a lot of cool shows came out in the 90s, and we're just going to keep working our way through the decades until we get to the current year. Just want to remind you guys, I have this packet that if anybody wants a copy of this packet, I'll be happy to get it for you. I also have videos that go along with this material that I'm happy to send along to you and your families if you want to check out the videos. I hope you're enjoying this. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy sharing this information with y'all. It's fun to kind of reminisce and talk about shows from back in the day. God bless you guys.